A black-haired girl dressed in red, who hails from the southwestern lands and is at the age of 15, will end the coming age of darkness and despair. La maga de la fogile e de la sabbia, la bruja de hoja y arena, la sorcière du feu et du sable, die Zauberin aus Blut und Sand, der Zauberers von Blatt und Sand, ha to suna no majo. In loving memory of Isao Takahata, the greatest colleague and mentor of Hayao Miyazaki and co-founder of Studio Ghibli, the 40th anniversary of which I present to you all a storybook made from March to September of 2025, which happens to be the first complete version of the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand ever made. On the day the last Trian dies, the golden master orb shall fall upon the lonely tree, and 2 dragons of steel shall plunder the entire land, for control over it and its awesome power to conquer and destroy. But only a black-haired sorceress dressed in red, who hails from the southwestern lands and is at the age of 15, can end the coming age of darkness and despair. Only she can use her mastery of water, earth, air, and fire to foil the plans of the dragons of steel. Only she can turn their delusional ways of greed, might, and ill will into compassion, kindness, and love for others. Only she can bring them to justice with the trust of the gods and spirits of nature. And only she alone can destroy the golden master orb with her magic, so that once she is raised from the ashes, the sorceress of leaf and sand shall witness for herself the sight of 100,000 white birds flying over the forest of hope. The Prophecy of the West. The Sorceress of Leaf and Sand. A tale made to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Studio Ghibli, made in commemoration and made in loving memory and dedication to Isao Takahata. For over 50 long years, a war over the possession of the Golden Master Orb, and thus the dominion of the entire world, has ravaged the island continent of Aetherosia. But in the southwestern lands, which have not been affected by the war that is raging abroad, a young mage named Keiko Yamamoto has lived a pastoral life with her caring family. But on the day she turned 15 and her magical education came to an end, she was given a few special gifts for her birthday: a new crimson dress that came with a wide-brimmed hat and a pair of black boots, a magic staff for her to channel forth her power, and a scrying stone for her to look into the past and the future, and to see people, places, and events from afar. On the evening right after her birthday party, Keiko donned her new outfit in front of her father, and she was curious to know about the ancient text that he was constantly reading at his study. Hitoshi then told his daughter that the text had to do with some ancient spells that the Trians made regarding the creation and destruction of their most sacred possession, the Golden Master Orb. But that night, a huge, mysterious airship crash-landed onto a grassy field near the Yamamoto's house, and Keiko joined the other residents of the southwestern lands in rescuing the ship's victims. But of all the survivors who eventually succumbed to their wounds, it was Princess Hilda who gave the mage a few mysterious documents for her to throw into the flames, but not without heeding some very important advice. Please, go into the forest of hope and find the golden orb that sits upon the branches of the lonely tree, before the goblin empires of Arpon and Thuban do so. The next morning, the residents of the southwestern lands heard the roaring of hundreds of aircraft engines, and they all looked up to see an entire fleet of Imperial Thebanian army airships, bombers, fighters, and transports tearing across the partly cloudy spring sky. At the head of the fleet was Emperor Terius the Just of the Thebanian Empire, who landed the Wild Blue Yonder, his personal armored juggernaut of a warplane, in the middle of the lands, stepped out onto a wide grassy hill with his entourage, and goaded the people of the southwestern lands into joining his ambitious enterprise, lest they face total annihilation. But upon hearing that the Golden Orb documents have all been burned at the hands of the Yamamoto's daughter, he had them captured while Keiko was taken into the safety of the borderland woods by the little wood elf Robbie Hyde and his big wise pet raccoon Vicky. And it was from them that Keiko soon learned about the ancient prophecy of the West, a prophecy that she was destined to fulfill right before the world's ending. And with that in mind, Keiko, Robbie, and Vicky, the raccoon, all ventured together into the vast, swampy forests of the Green Marshes, and it was there that the trio found out that the resident nature gods and spirits were no longer trustworthy of mankind due to his rising arrogance and indifference towards the natural world. But Keiko and her friends were none of the less able to give a sick forest spirit a few magic herbs in order to cure it of the contaminated and polluted food and water that it just consumed. All throughout her journey across the Green Marshes, Keiko used the power of her magic and spells to overwhelm and undo the plans of the Arpanian and Thebanian empires to drain the wetlands and industrialize the land with much pollution involved. And with forests growing over the ruins of factories, the mage took her friends on a calm canoe ride across the swampy woods where the tall cypress trees grew. But once the trio reached a long, narrow river that flowed through a tall ravine, Keiko summoned a lone vine that was hanging above the river to swing her and her friends to the other side as giant, hungry alligator gods and spirits lunged and snapped at their heels. And as the sun sank under the woods, the trio stumbled upon a giant oak tree, spent the coming night sleeping upon its branches, and were soon startled from their slumber to find a small herd of tall-crest forest gods browsing upon the leaves under the light of the full moon. On the following day, the trio entered the market town of Bedford, and Keiko used her magic to pacify a swarm of attacking tree spirits that were terrorizing its residents. As the three travelers reached the northern lands of the Green Marshes, they all came across a stream and were quite surprised to find two flamingo-headed river spirits fighting over a lump of fish-shaped trash that was probably thrown into the river by careless men or goblins, and Keiko turned it into an actual fish that was as long as a man's arm with a quick snap of her fingers. And once the trio soon went to fetch some water at the edge of a small waterfall, they were all caught unawares by a small company of knights led by Beziel the Bold, who were patrolling the southernmost frontier lands of the county of Comtea. And despite a tense encounter in which Keiko tried to use her magic to scare off the knights' horses, and the knights in turn tried to pin her down and prosecute her for being a witch, she and Beziel, captain of the guard of Comtea's armies, laid aside their differences and soon came to amicable terms with one another in their shared goals of stopping the long war between the Arpanian and Thubanian empires that has ravaged their shared homeland, the island continent of Aetherosia, and their commitment to a better, more peaceful world worth fighting for. And so it was that Keiko continued to lead Robbie and Vicky, the raccoon, across the northern frontier of the Green Marshes with an even loftier goal in mind that she shared with Basil the Bold. And along the way, the travelers were able to purchase 3 individual tickets to board the fabled magical Black Valley Express at the insistence of Vicky, who knew that to reach the lands who knew that doing so was the easiest way for them to reach the lands where the county of Comptea and the Black Mountains meet. And after having risked their lives wandering across the infamous and treacherous Swamp of Sorrows, the trio soon ascended the top of the 750-foot tall watchtower of Udul Hadun, which the kings of the West which was once built in ancient times by the kings of the West to watch over their lands, and soon used for the same purpose by the Count of Comptea, and they were all treated to a magnificent view of the many vast lands that lay beyond the green marshes. The trio also spotted not only the Black Mountains looming in the distance, but also their namesake train heading towards where the southernmost station is. After Keiko promptly assumed her bird form to fly her friends over to the station and boarded the train with them for Comptea and its neighboring mountains, she came across dozens of terrified children, many of whom were orphans who had lost their parents to the war, huddled in threes in some cars at the back with a few women or seniors to protect them. And that was from the personal accounts and stories of those shell-shocked refugees that Keiko learned about the devastating toll that the Dubanian bombers have brought to the cities and towns of Arpanian allied countries further south. The mage also dined with her friends in a car that was called the Marvelous Mockingbird and looked more or less like a pub than the usual dining car, and upon stepping out of the train at their destination, the travelers were greeted with a shower of leaflets that came from a passing Thubanian warplane. But it was in the Arpanian allied human kingdom of Paisana that Keiko and her friends witnessed nearly 100 soldiers struggling to fight off the giant mechanical war elephants of the Imperial Thubanian army, and she also lovingly brought forth magical bowlfuls of fruits, meats, veggies, and her own special herbal medicine to feed and tend to the needs of the injured and wounded Paisanan soldiers at the request of their weary commanders and officers as their daily rations dwindled. After doing those arduous tasks and using her magic to help the county of Comptea and Bezio the Bold end the Arpan-Thuban War, Keiko led her friends further up into the valleys of the Black Mountains. They hiked across expanses of steep, rolling hills that were dotted here and there with many firs and pines, and the verdant meadows were in full bloom with fields of wildflowers. They came in different shades of blue, yellow, white, red, pink, and purple. But along the way, the three travelers will also soon stumble upon a giant Quetzalcoatlus god named Arashi, who happens to be the guardian spirit of the entire land. Yet Keiko's hike across the Black Mountains, however, did not go unnoticed, for the rulers of the Arpanian and Thebanian empires both perceived the sorceress of leaf and sand and her magic spells to be a major threat to their own plans for the colonial conquest of Aetherosia, the exploitation of the island continent's raw materials, natural resources, and minerals, and the enslavement and subjugation of its various peoples. But the bold and steadfast Keiko kept on holding back the attacks and threats of her goblin assailants, one by one. One day, she stopped a battalion of Arpanian tanks and a Thubanian fighter plane from harassing panic-stricken indigenous civilians. And another day, she flew off in her bird form to fend off an assault from the wild blue yonder and its fighter escorts by daringly facing them head on. But Arashi the Quetzalcoatlus was quick to reassure Keiko and her friends that his fellow nature spirits were on her side and will soon protect her from the assault of the goblins. And soon he flew the three travelers in a straight path over the hills and mountains, and across the partly cloudy skies to where the floating island kingdom of Liftia, the last surviving realm of the legendary skyfarers of old, is. The queen of that country was eager to seek Keiko's magical aid in the defense of her rich kingdom from the attacks of the Arpanian and Thebanian air fleets, and she rewarded the mage for her services with some special gifts and made her a heroine of Liftia. So here is Keiko and her friends flying atop Arashi to the sky realm of Liftia, and we can see here that the Liftians have continued to uphold their old ways and traditions long after most of the other Skyfarers fell from disgrace due to their corrupted lives being heavily reliant on technology. And so the supreme gods of Aetherosia granted the Skyfarers refuge over the peaks of the Black Mountains for continuing to stick on to the traditional Skyfarer ways. Afterwards, following a tense encounter with some goblin airships, Arashi proceeded to fly Keiko and her friends east and back towards the meadows of the Black Mountains. And as the sun was sinking, he landed the trio close to the foot of a great grassy hill upon which stood a quaint little cottage that was home to Greta, a young girl who was roughly Keiko's age, as well as her kind grandmother and mother. This little family lovingly provided the tired Keiko and her friends with a few refreshing evening meals and tea, as well as a decent place for them to sleep. On the following day, the family provided a morning breakfast for the travelers, and Keiko thanked those women for their hospitality before she and her friends left their cottage for the dangerous forest of despair, which lay right below the hill to the east of the Black Mountains, and was teeming with giant, fell serpents that could kill a man with their lethal venom. But Keiko was able to fend off the serpents with her magic spells, until at last she had finally broken a curse which had kept the resident Therizinosaur forest god dormant for centuries. Keiko, Robbie, and Vicky all paid their respects to the great forest spirit, left the Forest of Despair, and soon reached the westernmost outskirts of the vast and expansive Silver Plains. And it was there that they stumbled upon a small flock of strange, kangaroo-like dinosaurs that were known as steppe swans. Keiko bonded with and mounted one, and nicknamed it Kyofu, which means strong wind, in the tongue of her ancestors. And when a fleet of Thebanian warplanes, led by Tereus the Just and his wild blue yonder, swooped in to hunt down the steppe swans for sport. Keiko proceeded to lead the flock away from their sudden onslaught and used her magic to trick and distract the warplanes into hunting a different fake target, while she and the steppe swans escaped in another direction. Afterwards, Kyofu continued to take Keiko and her friends on a bounding ride across the Silver Plains to where the Sands of Fate are, all while the free peoples of Aetherosia, who were busy fighting off the Arpanians and Thebanians, were about to face their darkest hour. Upon reaching the winding dunes of the Sands of Fate, Kyofu continued to guide Keiko and her friends around there for the first half of the journey, and he soon left the travelers to walk across the dunes on their own for the second half. Although they sweltered at times under the scorching heat of the midday sun, Keiko and her friends were able to conjure or find enough sources of water to quench their thirst, and along the way they encountered serpent-like lizards which jumped through the sand like dolphins in the ocean, a tribe of scimitar-wielding sand elves who were well versed in the riddles and lore of the desert, and many tribes of horse-riding men who fought each other over its few remaining water holes. Keiko also used her magic to disrupt the oil-wielding activities of the goblins and their human allies. Sometimes, with the use of sandstorms, she conjured herself, and soon she and her friends discovered a secret underground passageway to the Hells of Fire, which was guarded at the end by a fierce half-centipede, half-human demoness. After defeating her in a battle, the demoness kindly showed the trio the path to the fabled land of cliffs and cacti. And it was there that Keiko, Robbie, and Vicky all came face to face with Julius, a ferocious, fire-breathing Carcharodontosaur desert god who has an infamously bad temper. Yet despite his fearsome, dragon-like reputation, Julius was quick to use his aggressive temperament and fiery breath to guard the sorceress and her friends. Once Keiko calmly and kindly reassured the dinosaur god that she is not affiliated with any of his former goblin or human oppressors, and that she'll protect him with her compassion and magic, or magic if necessary. And along the way, and after Julius and after Julius helped Keiko out in many of her endeavors and led her and her friends across the hills of fire through the narrow passes of the Red Mountains and down to the edge of the Great Canyon, which separates the Forest of Hope from the desert lands of the East, all whilst encountering the last surviving Fire Maiden, Tara Karanteka, and her ferocious pet salamanders. The sorceress and her friends all paid their respects to the Carcharodontosaur desert spirit, and Arashi soon arrived to fly the trio across and high over the canyon and straight towards where the legendary Four Cliffs, which mark the southernmost borders of the Forest of Hope, are. But along the way, Keiko and her friends could see that the airships and warplanes of the Arpanian and Thebanian Imperial air fleets were heading in the same direction. Were heading in the same exact direction as they were, and the mage quickly warned the local human civilians to leave and seek higher ground, to take shelter before the goblin armies arrived for the final battle. At the edge of the Forest of Hope, Keiko, Robbie Hyde, and Vicky soon discovered that Emperor Darius the Just had recently built the giant spiraling factory fortress of Gun Hades, which was pumping out great amounts of toxic, polluting smoke from its tall smokestacks as small warplanes flew around its many turrets, and newly built tanks rolled out from its walls to assemble and marshal his industrialized army for a massive assault upon the Arpanian positions that were within striking distance of the great lonely tree, as well as upon much of the surrounding forest itself. Then the sorceress led her friends on a daring but well-planned infiltration of Gun Hades, used her magic to disable much of the fort's assembly lines and other forms of industrial infrastructure, and fought off the many goblin guards which stood in her way, until at last she reached and opened the doors of the Dubanian Emperor's military headquarters and throne room, and politely demanded him to peacefully give up his warmongering ways, call off his upcoming attack on the Forest of Hope, and allow her to deal with the Arpanians in a similar diplomatic way. But although Darius the Just initially and haughtily scoffed at Keiko's words, then got livid at her for trying to question his authority and challenged the sorceress to a magical duel, which ended with the collapse of his fortress by the pounding of her magic staff. He soon reluctantly accepted Keiko's demands for a just peace, only for her to witness bombers on both sides raining destruction from above onto the Forest of Hope below. In the enormous ensuing battle, which determined the fate of not only all of Aetherosia, but also that of the entire world of Sakaya, the huge armies and air fleets of the Arpanian and Dubanian empires, as well as those of their loyal human allies, clashed over the possession of the Golden Master Orb and turned much of the Forest of Hope into a blazing inferno of burning trees and logs. Yet amidst this chaos, the Comtean army, led by Beziel the Bold, tried to pacify the goblins, and so did Keiko in her attempts to prevent any further harm to the sacred old-growth forest and its inhabitants. But in her greatest time of need, the gods and spirits of nature arrived to help Keiko turn the tide against the goblin troops, and when she was knocked over by the trunk of a mechazon, Julius courageously rushed in to save her life by fending off the beastly war machine with the use of his horns, jaws, and fiery breath. And once she recovered, Keiko finally did the unthinkable deed of climbing up to the lonely tree, placing the tip of her staff upon the golden orb, and reciting an ancient, mysterious spell which shocked the whole world and destroyed the magical object of power and domination once and for all. The gigantic and fiery explosion, which scattered and blew away the airships, tanks, soldiers, and warplanes of the Arpanian and Dubanian armies, also obliterated much of the Forest of Hope and its surrounding lands, until they became barren, desolate wastelands, riddled with ashen smoke and seemingly devoid of life, until large crowds of excited human spectators could see with their own eyes a massive herd of dinosaurian and pterosaurian nature gods and spirits, arriving and gathering in a big circle around the spot where Keiko's hatless and seemingly lifeless body lay. Then they all repeatedly exhaled in unison so that they made magical swirls of golden dust which danced around her, and they all slowly began to lift all their heads up in unison. Then everyone gasped and watched in awe as Keiko's body, which was illuminated by a shining golden aura, steadily rose high into the air until it stopped as the clear blue stopped as a great flock of 100,000 white cranes tore across the clear blue sky as a field of seedlings, which emerged in the presence of the nature spirits, rose up to become large, mature trees as the Forest of Hope, including the once destroyed lonely tree, quickly recovered and regrew into its former state. And once Keiko opened her eyes to the sight of the white birds, thanked the gods and spirits for helping and supporting her in her greatest time of need, and stood up upon the golden aura to face the crowds with a smile. Everyone jubilantly cheered with much elation, for the ancient prophecy of the West had at last been fulfilled. The teenage girl soon rose down with a graceful twirl and regained her hat, and upon touching the ground, Basil the Bold ran up to her with much delight, lifted her up by the waist, and spun her around like a father playing with his daughter, much to the joy of Robbie Hyde and Vicky the Raccoon, as well as to the whole cheering crowd of bystanders, including Keiko's parents and siblings. And as the Arpanians and Thebanians left the newly risen Forest of Hope, and eventually all of Aetherosia for good, the world recovered as forests and deserts spread here and there, as nature and nature spirits took over the landscape and healed it of its wounds, as the humans rebuilt their cities, towns, and villages and learned to coexist with nature, and as Keiko began to start a new, peaceful life with Beziel, Robbie, and Vicky. So this is the end of my storybook version of the Sorceress and Leaf and Sand so far. If you really loved it, please be sure to like and subscribe in order to support my channel and to see more stuff about the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand like this. And I'll wish you all a happy new year.